Imagine a dark, damp hole in the ground, a wooden grate overhead. This is not a dungeon from a medieval castle. It is one of the earliest known prisons from ancient Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE. But it wasn't used to punish criminals. It was used to hold them until their trial or until their execution. The idea of prison as punishment didn't exist yet. Fast forward to ancient Greece. The philosopher Socrates was sentenced to death in 399 BCE. He was not thrown into a dungeon. He was placed under house arrest, guarded by officials until he drank the hemlock. For the Greeks, prison was a holding place, not a punishment. Fines, exile, the Romans changed everything. They built the first dedicated prisons like the Mamertine prison in Rome. It was a dark, underground cell with a hole in the floor for execution. Prison became a place of punishment, not just waiting. The powerful could be held there indefinitely, and many were executed in secret. But the idea of prison as a place for long-term punishment faded after Rome fell. For centuries, justice was swift: fines, mutilation, or death. Prisons were mostly for debtors or political prisoners. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that the modern prison system began to take shape, with workhouses and correctional facilities. Of prison as punishment did not exist. That idea came much, much later. To understand why, we have to look at how ancient societies thought about justice. In most early civilizations, crime was seen as a harm against an individual or a family, not against the state. The primary goal was restitution or revenge. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal codes, prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes, often based on the principle of an eye for an eye. But even then, imprisonment was not a standard penalty. Instead, offenders might be fined, beaten, exiled, or executed. The idea of locking someone up for a set period as a form of punishment simply did not occur to. Ancient Greece and Rome did have places of detention, but they were not prisons in the modern sense. They were used mainly to hold people awaiting trial or execution, not to punish them with a fixed sentence. The Romans, for example, had the Mamertine prison in Rome, a dark underground dungeon. But it was used to hold enemies of the state before their execution, not as a long-term punishment. The concept of a prison as a place where you serve time and then are released was completely foreign. Punishment was swift and often brutal: fines, flogging, exile, or death. During the Middle Ages in Europe, castles and town gates often had dungeons. But again, these were not prisons for punishment. They were holding cells for people awaiting trial, debtors, or political prisoners. The punishment itself was still physical: stocks, pillories, whipping, or execution. The church, however, introduced the idea of penance and confinement in monasteries for clergy who committed sins. This was a form of isolation meant to lead to repentance. It was a small step toward the idea that time spent in confinement could be redemptive. But for the common person, the real shift began in the 16th and 17th centuries. In England, houses of correction were established to discipline vagrants and petty criminals through hard labor. These were not prisons for serious crimes, but they introduced the idea of confinement as a punishment. Meanwhile, the rise of the nation-state and centralized legal systems meant that crime was increasingly seen as an offense against the state. The state needed a way to punish that was controlled, measurable, and could be applied uniformly. Imprisonment for a fixed term began to make sense. But it would take the Enlightenment and the work of reformers like Cesare Beccaria to truly transform the prison into the central institution of. Hammurabi, from around 1750 BCE, is famous for its principle of an eye for an eye. It prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes, but imprisonment was almost never one of them. Offenders were fined, beaten, exiled, or executed. Locking someone up for years served no purpose in that system. But that doesn't mean there were no places to hold people. In ancient Greece, the Athenians used a prison called the Desmoterion to hold people awaiting trial or execution. It was not a place for punishment, just a holding cell. Socrates himself was held there after his trial, drinking hemlock among friends. The Romans, too, had prisons like the Mamertine, a dark underground dungeon where captured enemies and political prisoners were kept before execution. But these were not prisons as we know them. They were temporary holding pens, not places of long-term confinement. The idea of using imprisonment as a standard punishment did not exist. Instead, societies relied on fines, physical punishment, exile, or death. The concept of a prison sentence, time served as a debt to society, would not emerge for centuries. The shift began slowly, influenced by the rise of Christianity and its emphasis on penance and redemption. Early monasteries sometimes confined monks to small cells for prayer and reflection, not as punishment, but as spiritual discipline. This idea of isolation as a path to moral improvement would later inspire the modern prison. But that transformation was still 1,000 years away. Of confinement, ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome all had holding cells. In Athens, the Desmoterion was a jail where defendants awaited trial. In Rome, the carcer was an underground cell used for prisoners before their execution. The most famous was the Mamertine prison, built in the 7th century BCE. It held enemies of the state like the Apostle Peter, who according to tradition was imprisoned here before his crucifixion. But these early jails were not for punishment. They were temporary holding pens. Punishment was physical, flogging, exile, or execution. The idea of imprisonment as a sentence didn't exist. That changed in the 16th and 17th centuries when workhouses and bridewells began to appear across Europe. These institutions were designed to reform the poor and idle through hard labor, but they were brutal. Men, women, and children were crammed into filthy cells. Disease spread quickly. The work was exhausting, yet this was the beginning of the prison as we know it. The next big shift came in the late 18th century when reformers began to demand. Reformers like John Howard and Jeremy Bentham argued that prisons should be places of rehabilitation, not just punishment. Bentham designed the Panopticon, a circular prison where a single guard could watch all inmates. Though never fully built, its design influenced modern prisons. Howard's work led to the Penitentiary Act of 1779, which promoted separate cells and useful labor. To work off a debt or punishment, slavery, not prison, was the default for serious crimes. The Roman Empire, for example, had no state-run prisons. They had private prisons run by slave dealers where convicts were held before being sold. The idea of locking someone up as punishment simply didn't exist. So when did that change? The shift began in the late 18th century with a movement led by religious groups like the Quakers. They argued that isolation and hard labor could reform criminals. In 1790, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia became the first true penitentiary. Prisoners were kept in solitary cells to reflect on their sins. The idea was that silence and solitude would lead to repentance. This model spread quickly. By the 19th century, prisons like Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania and Pentonville in London became symbols of a new approach. Prisoners wore uniforms, followed strict routines, and worked in silence. The goal was not just punishment, but moral reform. However, the reality was often harsh. Solitary confinement drove many prisoners insane. By the 20th century, the prison system had become a permanent fixture of modern society. But the original ideals of reform gave way to overcrowding, violence, and high recidivism rates. Today, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. The question remains, does prison actually work? Or is it just a modern version of a farmer or put him to work than to lock him up? Also, the concept of rehabilitation didn't exist. Justice was about retribution, not reform. The idea that a criminal could be corrected through isolation was foreign. So when did the shift begin? The first major change came not from lawmakers, but from the church. In medieval Europe, the church began using solitary confinement as a form of penance. Monks who broke their vows were locked in small cells to reflect on their sins. This was not yet prison as we know it, but the seed was planted. The idea that isolation could lead to repentance slowly took root. By the 16th century, this religious practice started to influence secular punishment. The first actual prisons designed for correction appeared in the late 1500s. One of the earliest was the Bridewell in London, which opened in 1555. It was a workhouse where vagrants and petty criminals were sent to learn discipline through labor. But the real turning point came in the late 18th century, when a British reformer named John Howard began inspecting prisons across Europe. He was horrified by what he found. In 1777, he published a book called The State of the Prisons, which exposed the overcrowding, disease, and corruption inside. Howard argued that prisoners should be men from women, children from adults, and the guilty from the merely accused. His work inspired a wave of prison reform across Europe and America. Within decades, the modern prison system began to take shape. But with it came a new kind of punishment, solitary confinement, and that would prove to be far more devastating than anyone imagined. Europe, the Catholic Church used confinement in monastic cells as a form of penance for clergy. This was called prison at the bishop's pleasure. It was a spiritual punishment, meant to lead to repentance through solitude and prayer. This idea slowly influenced secular authorities. By the 12th century, some European kings began using imprisonment as a punishment for common crimes, not just for holding prisoners before trial. These early prisons were often dungeons, dark, damp, and overcrowded. They were not designed for long-term confinement, but for holding people until trial, execution, or ransom. Over time, the idea of imprisonment as punishment spread across Europe, laying the groundwork for the modern prison system. For specific crimes like heresy or treason, but it was still rare. The real turning point came in the 16th and 17th centuries with the rise of the workhouse. In England, the 1576 Vagabonds Act established houses of correction for the poor and unemployed. These weren't prisons in the modern sense. They were places where vagrants were forced to work, often at hard labor like breaking stones or picking oakum. The idea was that idleness was the root of all vice, and that hard work would reform the poor. But these workhouses were harsh, dirty, and overcrowded. They were a form of punishment for being poor, not a place of rehabilitation. Over time, they evolved into something even more sinister. By the 18th century, workhouses had become a widespread system of social control. The 1723 Workhouse Test Act in England allowed parishes to deny relief to anyone who refused to enter a workhouse. This was the birth of the less eligibility principle, that life inside the workhouse must be worse than the worst life outside, to deter people from seeking help. The workhouse system reached its peak in the 19th century with the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act in Britain. This law created a national network of workhouses, designed to be so forbidding that only the truly desperate would enter. Families were separated, diets were meager, and labor was relentless. The workhouse became a symbol of Victorian society. Were forced to work, but they blurred the line between punishment and confinement. By the 17th century, these workhouses began holding petty criminals alongside the poor. Meanwhile, a new institution was emerging, the debtor's prison. In England and America, people who couldn't pay their debts could be imprisoned indefinitely until the debt was paid. This was not a simple punishment for crime. It was a system that trapped people in a cycle of poverty and incarceration, often for minor debts that could never be repaid from inside a cell. A punishment for a crime, but a coercive tool. Debtors were often held in terrible conditions, alongside violent criminals. The system was widely criticized, but it persisted into the 19th century. The most dramatic transformation, however, began in the late 18th century, driven by a small religious group, the Quakers. In Pennsylvania, Quakers believed that all people had an inner light and deserved humane treatment. They pushed for prison reform, arguing that isolation and labor could lead to repentance. This idea would reshape the American prison system, could find redemption through quiet reflection. They argued that criminals should not be tortured or executed, but placed in solitary cells to contemplate their sins. This was the birth of the penitentiary, a place for penitence. In 1790, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia was converted into the first true penitentiary. Prisoners were held in cells forbidden from speaking or working, with only a Bible for company. The idea was that silence and isolation would lead to genuine remorse. But the reality was far darker. Many prisoners went insane. The system, meant to reform, became a tool of psychological torture, yet the concept spread. In the 1820s, New York built Auburn Prison, which introduced a modified version. Prisoners slept alone but worked together in silence during the day. They were forbidden from even exchanging glances. This became known as the Auburn system. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania developed an even stricter model, the Pennsylvania system, where inmates were kept in complete isolation 24 hours a day. Both systems claimed to reduce crime, but critics noted high rates of mental breakdown and suicide. By the mid-19th century, the penitentiary had become a standard feature of Western justice. But the dream of redemption through isolation had failed. Instead of curing crime, these prisons often created more hardened criminals. The solitary cell, once seen as a humane alternative to the gallows, became a symbol of a new kind of suffering. The question remained, could punishment ever truly reform a human's confinement with only a Bible for company? The idea was that isolation would lead to remorse and reform, but the results were mixed. Many prisoners went mad, the system was expensive, and critics argued it was a form of torture. Despite these problems, the penitentiary model spread. In the 1820s, New York built Auburn Prison, which introduced the silent system. Prisoners worked together in silence during the day and slept in separate cells at night. This was cheaper than the Pennsylvania model and became popular across the United States. A new kind of prison discipline. By the mid-19th century, the Auburn system had become the standard for American prisons, influencing prison design worldwide. A modified system. Prisoners worked together in silence during the day and slept alone at night. This became known as the silent system. Pennsylvania, meanwhile, stuck with the separate system of complete isolation. Both models were exported to Europe and beyond. By the mid-19th century, imprisonment had become the dominant form of punishment in the Western world. The ancient idea of prison as a temporary holding cell had been replaced by the modern idea of prison as a place of punishment and reform. But the original Quaker vision of rehabilitation had largely failed. Prisons became overcrowded, violent, and recidivism rates were high. Today, over 10 million people are incarcerated worldwide. The prison system we have inherited is a massive, expensive, and often brutal institution. Many countries use prisons not just for serious crimes, but also for minor offenses, debt, or even political dissent. The system is also deeply unequal. In the United States, for example, Black Americans are incarcerated at nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans. Poverty, lack of access to legal representation, and mandatory minimum sentences have fueled this disparity. Reform efforts have emerged, from bail reform to restorative justice programs. But changing such a deeply entrenched system is slow and politically difficult. The question remains, can we build a justice system that truly rehabilitates rather than simply punishes? The modern prison system we have is the direct descendant of those early experiments in Pennsylvania and New York. But it's worth remembering that for most of human history, prison was not the answer. The idea that locking someone up for years could be just or effective is a relatively recent invention, one that continues to evolve and to be questioned. Prison is a relatively recent invention, one that continues to evolve and to be questioned.